Welcome to Session 3. The focus of this session is lesson plans. First, we'll look at all the lesson plan forms and the handout explaining the lesson plan components. Then we'll look at examples of actual lesson plans. After we inspect the examples, we'll go over the rules, such as the number of long detailed lesson plans that must be written before moving to the less detailed form, etc. Now let's take a look at the first slide. Find page 20 in the handbook. This is an example of a blank lesson plan form just like the one on this slide. It has all the components that clinical teachers are to address as they prepare their lesson plans. I send this lesson plan form to my clinical teachers electronically so that they have a template to work from as they prepare their lesson plans. Inform your clinical teachers that they are to use this form for their long detailed lesson plans and let them know though that by including fewer details for each lesson plan component, it will also work for their short form lesson plans. For the next slide, find page 21 in the handbook. This page has information about each of the lesson plan components. You will want to review this information with your clinical teachers. Add any information that you feel would be pertinent concerning any of these components, and make sure that they understand that they are to address all of these components for each lesson plan they compose, both long and short forms. Once they're given permission to go to the short form, which we will discuss next, less detail would be needed for each lesson cycle component. On the next slide, you will see a copy of the handout specifically designed for short form lesson plans. This form is not in the handbook, so you're looking for one of your miscellaneous handouts that look like this form that's on the slide. Let your clinical teachers know that they are not required to use this short form lesson plan. You will want to make it available to them as an option, though, for their short form lesson plans, and they also have the option of composing their own short form lesson plan as long as all of the lesson cycle components are included. Remind the clinical teachers again that the long form on page 20 in the handbook will also work for short form by simply including less detail for each component. On the next 3 slides, we will inspect 3 sample lesson plans. These are part of the miscellaneous handouts that you printed before beginning this session. So pause here if you need to until you find the 3 sample lesson plans. Put them in this order. First, the long detailed lesson plan on ecosystems, which is 5th grade. Then the example of the less detailed lesson plan, which is also 5th grade, and it's on probability. And finally, the short form lesson plan on geometry. You're now looking at the slide that displays the long detailed lesson plan on ecosystems. Look at your handout that is identical to this slide. Note the lesson cycle components that will be included on each lesson plan, and they are objectives, TLAC-US, materials, teaching procedure, which consists of motivation, prior learning, statement of objective, purpose, and instructional steps, closure, which includes review and future learning, lesson extension and or modifications, and assessment of learning. Note the scripting on this lesson plan, which sets the clinical teachers up for success. And this makes them think in advance about what they will say and do for each lesson cycle component. Naturally, it will not be verbatim when they are actually teaching the lesson. It is definitely a good idea to make the 3 sample lesson plans available to your clinical teachers. Also tell them that these are actual lesson plans written by other clinical teachers, and so for that reason they're not perfect. The next slide is the sample lesson plan on probability. Point out to your clinical teachers that this lesson plan has the same lesson cycle components as the previous one on ecosystems, but it has less detailed for each component. Looking at the next slide, you see a short form lesson plan, and this lesson plan on geometry is in the horizontal format. And notice that it still has all of the lesson cycle components, but has even less detail than the previous one on probability. In summary, and this is a repeat, remind your clinical teachers of several things. First, all lesson cycle components should be addressed on each lesson plan. Second, as they progress and gain experience, less and less detail is needed. And third, if they do not want to use the horizontal format for their short form lesson plans, they do not have to. Remind them that the original long form, which is on page 20 in the handbook, could be used for the short form lesson plan simply by shortening the amount of detail on each lesson cycle component. The last slide in this session on lesson plans is entitled Lesson Plan Requirements. So find the handout with the same title. It's one of the miscellaneous handouts that you printed for this session. This handout has detailed information about the requirements and rules for writing lesson plans. It's not included in the handbook, which contains more general information on lesson planning. And so for this reason, I also included in the mentoring folder for cooperating teachers. So you will see and hear about it again when we get to that last audio session. And I also give my clinical teachers a copy of this handout when we're discussing lesson plans at our seminars. Look at this handout. Find the question on the handout that says, how many detailed lesson plans are required before progressing to a less detailed and then shorter version? The answer to this question is divided into elementary and middle school, high school. For elementary, note that 5 detailed lesson plans will be written for each subject area or block of time. Once these 5 lessons have been successfully taught, the clinical teacher will be given permission by the cooperating teacher to utilize a less detailed form for several lessons before moving to the short form in that subject area only. Note that less detailed and short form simply means using the same form as used for the detailed lesson plan, but writing less detailed for each component. And remember that they could also choose to use that horizontal format if they wanted to. Every time a new subject area or block of time is added to the clinical teacher's responsibility, 5 detailed lesson plans are again needed in that subject area or block of time before moving to a less detailed then shorter form for that subject area. As the semester progresses, the amount of detail decreases depending on the amount of detail the individual clinical teacher needs in order to be successful. So to clarify, once a clinical teacher has met the requirement of 5 detailed lesson plans, he or she should include after that only the amount of detail that is personally needed to be successful. And of course that is with the blessing of the cooperating teacher. Note that the clinical teacher who's preparing for 5 or 6 subject areas, even 4 subject areas daily, should be on the short form for all subjects by the time he or she is in full responsibility. An exception would be if a clinical teacher chooses on his or her own to write more detail for a particular subject area, and that does happen a lot. And another exception would be if a clinical teacher is struggling and needs to stay on a more detailed lesson plan form in order to experience success. And the clinical teacher and or the university supervisor could require a more detailed lesson plan for an extended period of time of their choosing. Now, for middle school, high school, note that it states, generally the clinical teacher will begin with the follow me approach. This approach requires the clinical teacher to prepare or pre-plan with the cooperating teacher. Write out a long detailed lesson plan based on this pre-planning session. Observe the cooperating teacher model how to teach this lesson. make needed adjustments to the prepared plan while observing the cooperating teacher teach this lesson, and finally, independently teach the lesson to another class. When the clinical teacher is ready, he or she plans and teaches his or her lessons with lesson list guidance. The middle school, high school clinical teacher will write at least 5 long, detailed lesson plans in each subject area, and then a slightly less detailed version all the way through the first full responsibility. Note, decisions here may be influenced on whether there is 1 prep versus 2 preps, etc. From then on, the clinical teacher will include the amount of detail that is personally needed to be successful, and this will be an individual decision. Depending on how successful the clinical teacher has been, the cooperating teacher may approve the short lesson plan for the first full responsibility and thereafter, and that is okay. Under the question, what options are available for the lesson plan form, there is a note in bold print, and it says, some school districts have online lesson planning programs that their teachers must use. Although it is ideal for clinical teachers to stay with our lesson plan format, it is acceptable to transfer to an alternative format after, and I underline after, the initial 5 long detailed lesson plans have been written. More details should be added to the district's format if possible. Also note that some school districts also provide teachers with prepackaged lesson plans. The teacher is told everything to say and do, and in this case, have the clinical teachers prepare the initial 5 long detailed lesson plans on our forms. After this requirement has been satisfactorily met, the clinical teachers may make copies of the prepared lesson plans that have been provided by the school district. The clinical teachers are to label our lesson cycle components on these copies. If a component such as, for example, stating the lesson objective or maybe establishing purpose is missing, the clinical teacher is to add it by writing it on the lesson plan itself. Under the question, are there subject areas or blocks of time that do not require a detailed lesson plan? The answer is yes, and examples are given. Basically, you empower the cooperating teachers to decide this. Under the question, when are lesson plans due to the cooperating teacher, make it clear that by Friday of the second week of the clinical teaching semester, the clinical teacher should submit all lesson plans for the following week to his or her cooperating teacher. This policy continues for the remainder of the semester. These lesson plans that have been read and initialed by the cooperating teacher will be filed in the clinical teaching notebook by the clinical teacher. And when you, the university supervisor, go to observe, you will be spot checking these lesson plans every single time that you're there, and they should be in that notebook. You might want to initial the components from each lesson plan that you read, and this will assure the clinical teacher that you are indeed monitoring what is written on these lesson plans. Discuss any issues that are spotted with the clinical teacher during the follow-up conference. Here are a few issues or questions that surface nearly every semester about lesson planning, and I'll try to go over these very quickly. Where it is appropriate, you want to be flexible with the Friday deadline for lesson plans. For example, perhaps a cooperating teacher meets with the clinical teacher late in the week to discuss the following week's lesson plans, therefore not giving the clinical teacher adequate time to prepare by Friday all the lesson plans for the following week. In this case, Monday may be the fairest solution to this problem. So tactfully coordinate this solution with the cooperating teacher, though. And in elementary, another issue often comes up. If a grade level meets 1 day a week to prepare lesson plans for the following week, here's the question: should a clinical teacher use these team plans? And here's a suggestion of what to say. You can tell the clinical teacher to participate in these planning sessions, but to go off on his or her own and adapt these lesson plans to follow or meet our requirements. Also, another issue that often comes up is when there's more than one clinical teacher in a grade level. The question is it okay if the clinical teachers plan together? And the answer is absolutely yes. However, after the clinical teachers plan together, they should go off on their own, go their separate ways, and write out their own lesson plans. It's always interesting to me that even though the activity itself may be the same, the clinical teachers will differ in their sequence of instructional steps or just their overall approach to teaching the lesson. In elementary, another issue that may or may not come up is this. If a grade level, for example, divides up the planning for the various subject areas and then shares the lesson plans with all the other teachers on the team, what's the clinical teacher to do regarding these shared plans? Here's my answer. I tell the clinical teacher to take the lesson plans prepared by other teachers and adapt them to our lesson plan format. I remind them to be sure to address all appropriate lesson cycle components. Also, I remind them to add to or delete so as to personalize the lesson plans. And this will give the clinical teacher a sense of ownership and therefore ensure that the clinical teacher is more successful. These are just a few of the more common issues that we face each semester with lesson planning. For all others, handle them in the most professional manner possible, making sure that the clinical teachers are gaining the experience that will prepare them for their own future classrooms. This concludes Session 3.